everyone hear me? I know these mics have been a little interesting. So before we get started, I would just be curious to see a show of hands for those who are students here. Okay, wonderful. And how many of you have taken immigration law or constitutional law or a critical race studies class? Okay, all right, wonderful. And faculty members of any law school or scholars, practitioners, otherwise? Okay, any immigration lawyers in the room?
Or,
okay,
I mean,
wonderful. Welcome. Yeah.
Or right on the ground, right?
Yeah.
Or on,
yeah. I mean, full time in
right,
the
full-time,
trenches. Yeah. So, welcome. Thank you so much for coming. Thanks to the organizers of this conference. It's really an honor to be here. Critical race studies and critical legal theory has been very meaningful to me personally for a long time, since my studies at UC Santa Barbara back in the 1990s, where Cedric Robinson was my professor. So I don't think I ever would have dreamed that I would be here today with all of you, and I'm really honored to be able to do so and to put together this panel for you. Today what we'll be doing is talking a bit about something called critical immigration legal theory. And Kathleen Kim, who I will introduce in just a moment, will get us started on that. And then we're going to have sort of a more informal conversation. We'll talk a bit about our work and then discuss some specific questions and hopefully give all of you an opportunity to kind of engage. If it was a smaller group, I'd wanted to go around and have people introduce themselves so we could get to know each other. But unfortunately, there isn't necessarily time for that. So first, we have Ming Chen, who is a professor of law at UC Law SF, which was formerly Hastings School of Law. And she also directs the Race, Immigration, Citizenship, and Equality Center, RICE. And then we have Yolanda Vasquez, who is a law professor at the University of Cincinnati School of Law. And Kathleen Kim, Los Angeles professor, and are you a native of? No, not a native of LA. I knew that, but essentially feels like it at this point. Professor of law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, and I am a Los Angeles native, born here, and I am a law professor of legal writing at the University of San Francisco School of Law. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kathleen to introduce critical immigration legal theory.
Thanks, Carrie. Sorry. Anytime I have a mic in front of me these days, I feel like a lot of comic relief is necessary, but I don't hit it. There are a lot of failed jokes that very forgiving audiences still force a chuckle at. But first, thank you so much to our dear colleague and friend, Carrie Rosenbaum, immigration scholar, for wrangling us all together to present here, and thanks for this anniversary of the Critical Race Symposium Studies program here at UCLA for accepting our proposal. So I have co-authors with whom I worked with to put out this article, relatively recently published, called "Critical Immigration Legal Theory." But this is not like a self-proclaimed term or phenomenon. This is something. This was an attempt to observe, capture, and amplify the voices of many immigration legal scholars, those of whom are all represented here on this panel. And I also want to acknowledge Ming Chen for using the term that I wanted to use. We resolved with my co-authors critical immigration legal theory because she writes about this phenomenon critical immigration studies or critical immigration theory in her book, and then also this is a concept that has been discussed at other critical theory conferences such as LabCrit and others. So those are my priors and also disclaimers. This is really an attempt to celebrate and highlight the work and the growing trend of this work that runs in parallel to the growth and expansion of immigration legal scholarship, and as a result immigration scholars into legal academia, which represents a very diverse demographic. And who immigration legal scholars are today is a combination of former civil rights or immigrants' rights lawyers, advocates, activists, and also scholars and educators who blur the lines between podium and research faculty and clinical. And that's those are remarkable attributes of this scholarly community, because decades ago, immigration legal scholarship and immigration law as a field of study in US law schools was something that was dismissed or not even recognized. And I'm not just saying this because Hiroshi's in the room, Professor Motomura, but he is in the room, so I have to call that out. But Hiroshi Motomura and a very small cohort of his friend colleagues started this movement of immigration law and legal scholarship being recognized in academia. And he and his dear colleagues, some of who have passed, but the others, not many, because there were 8. There were 8 that convened the first immigration law teachers and scholars workshop in 1994. And here we are in 2025, and Loyola in Los Angeles had the honor of hosting the 2022 Immigration Law Teachers and Scholars Workshop during the height of a COVID surge, and over 100 registrants attended in person. And the theme of the conference and the focus of it was going beyond resistance and focusing on critical inquiry. So critical inquiry in its methodology and also in its praxis dimension. And the way the themes of the plenaries were conceived, not so incidentally, I mean, it deliberately drew from many critical modes of inquiry, including critical race theory, critical race feminism, critical intersectional studies, and the result was numerous conversations around where do we go from here and what does the future of immigration law look like. And here we are today, and we see what the future, a very dystopic reality, and the work of my colleagues up here, and Hiroshi and Rose, and others have, it was almost prescient, I think, almost prescient in centering the role of immigration laws, policies, and practices in the United States in constructing race, and the role of that racial construction in reifying social, political, and economic hierarchies that exclude and subordinate people of color and other non-citizen outsiders of historically oppressed identity groups. So these legal scholars, educators, advocates, activists, and what my co-authors and I called critical immigration legal scholars, but not to determine or define anyone, but we have observed firsthand the onslaught of government perpetrated abuses against non-citizens of color and those perceived as such. And the rollout of Project 2025 under Trump administration number 2 really relies on almost an absurdly permissive interpretation of the immigration plenary power, or the exclusive authority over immigration regulation by the political branches of the federal government to dismiss all statutory and constitutional due process protections in its effort to extinguish progressive politics and people of color altogether. So, so the purpose of this panel is to continue this conversation and bring it to all of you and engage with all of you to grapple with immigration law, policy, and practices, and also its legitimacy, especially, and also its relationship to the legitimacy of law and democracy in light of these political realities. So I think that's sufficient for starting us off. Thanks.
Super, thank you, Kathleen. Sorry. My first question is for each of the panelists, starting with Yolanda and then Ming, to talk about the applications of critical race theory and critical race studies to your own research and how you either initially conceptualized yourself to be doing or understood yourself to be doing critical race studies work as immigration scholars, or if that became something that you realized you were doing later, either intentionally or otherwise.
Kathleen, when did you start in academia?
2007.
Okay. So I guess I'm the oldest one in academia.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So no, and I say that because, you know, I was here last night and we were talking about the 25 years and where they've come and how many of them came from UCLA and are privileged to have done so. I did not come from UCLA, and to be quite honest, my road, it was a hard road, and I think it continues to be a hard road. And I think they mentioned that in the prior plenary this morning, is that we're not all blessed to be in a supportive environment for immigration, or particularly when it talks about the way in which race, gender, et cetera, have shaped or been shaped by certain policies, in this case, immigration. And so it's interesting because I know last night we talked about whether or not, you know, one of the speakers talked about whether or not we were born free. And I think, you know, I started law school in the early 90s, and obviously critical race theory had already begun. But LatCrit, for instance, hadn't officially started till 1995. And so I don't necessarily think, I mean, it was there, but I didn't know about it in law school. Like, they didn't talk about it. Race wasn't an issue. So I don't think I was born free. I think I was still born and continue to be part of the struggle. And so with that said, when I first started in Chicago as a public defender, I was, which many of you may not know, is actually the largest unified court system in the world, even though Los Angeles also has the privilege of having, right, one of the hugest carceral states as well. And so in there, it's horizontal representation, which means that the public defenders stay in the courtroom and they take the cases in which the defendants come into that courtroom. They don't follow that particular defendant. And so because it's also situated by neighborhoods, and I was one of the few Latinx public defenders, I was put in a predominantly Latino neighborhood, right? So in that courtroom, and so many were not actually U.S. citizens. And then in 1996, we all know EDPA and IRA came down, two of the harshest bills that had immigration in it, which increased the number of criminal offenses that became deportable, right? Decreased relief within the immigration system, and also increased enforcement. As you can imagine, my life, one of my immigration attorney friends said, "Did you realize these two came down? Here's the bill, read it. And you're in a domestic violence courtroom," which, you know, is a deportable offense. And so it was my introduction to immigration. So I come at it from a criminal law. I do not come from it from an immigration, although I ended up doing immigration later. But with that said, I continued to be once I went into academia, I continued to be an anomaly that didn't have a home, right? Within critical race theory, some of the growing pains was whether or not critical race theory was predominantly about a black-white binary, right? And so lat crit grows out of that and embraces that. But immigration, right, and criminal law, you get, well, you're not really a criminal law scholar because you talk about immigration. Well, you're not really an immigration scholar because you come at it from the framework of criminal procedure. And I'm going, oh my freaking God here, right? And then the other thing is you're at an institution which doesn't support, right? Your pre-tenure doesn't support race scholarship. And then I, obviously, being in a very high percentage of Latino defendants, and knowing about this, and it wasn't part of the Sixth Amendment right to receive, right, immigration information about the consequences if someone pleads guilty, right? And so I started from a Sixth Amendment constitutional law standpoint, even though I talked about the way it subordinated Latinos, right? And that there should be a right to a Sixth Amendment right. This was before Padilla. And so, in fact, right, I helped with the Padilla case, and I got hate mail, right? And, oh, this is bad, you shouldn't be doing this, that, and the other. And I remember I was actually flying here for a conference, and when I picked up my phone, it had just blew up in Padilla. It came down. And so it created the Sixth Amendment, but I also teach criminal procedure. And so, again, there's no place in criminal procedure for talking about immigration, right? You're not supposed to teach about United States versus Martinez Fuerte, Brignone Ponce, Padilla, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the crazy things that I think we have to maintain for our own sanity is you have to just stop listening to the feedback, right? And so, but it was hard because pre-tenure, right, you're supposed to do what you want. You're supposed to listen, right, to advocates who are advocating for you to be able to get tenure. So that's a very long-winded way of saying, and within immigration, it was weird because they're like, why talk about race? That's immigration. So you don't need to talk about it because it's just 100% part of it. And so it was really interesting trying to educate people. And so now here we are in 2025. It has a name. It has a home. And I'm thinking, wow, we've really come far. We have far to go, but it's just really great to be able to have a group of individuals because power comes from that, right? And legitimacy comes from that. And so it's really great to have students here and also to see everyone who has stuck with it through the years. And so my work, right, is really influenced still by my criminal law background, but we'll talk about this later because I can't remember how much time I have. But it also has grown to international, right? So I have visited all in Europe, right? And it's really interesting because the fight continues there because they say Americans have obsession with race. We don't have that obsession. And so because it's not about race in Europe. For instance, look, they'll admit that they're prejudiced against certain individuals, but they'll say, well, those are Eastern Europeans and they're still white, so it's not a racial issue. And so trying to be able to have conversations about race and what it means as a social construction, and it doesn't always have to be about whether someone is black or white or brown or whatever, is really interesting and frustrating in the fact that here we are in 2025 or before, a couple of years before, and I'm still, having a conversation with people. And even when I was at the EUI in Florence,
What's the EUI?
The European University Institute, which was created by the EU in order for them to do research on the policies that the EU has either created or wants to create, in order for feedback as to whether we can have whole discussions about what I really think it's about. But anyway, it's interesting because, now I just lost what was I? That's what old ages get like.
Become race
Right.
conversations.
These conversations about race, even like when I was at the EUI and the Ukrainian war came down. And for many people, right, you saw on TV that they were allowing white Ukrainians to pass through, but anyone who was not, quote unquote, white was stuck at the border, right? And even then, right, there was still a denial about how race, right, shaped immigration policy, or when we know, Hungary's was talking about, Orban was talking about, well, they're different, right? These are refugees. They look like us. They have blonde hair and blue eyes, but yet he denies it ever sort of being about race, right? We have, and in fact, when I was visiting at the University of Oxford, and we did a book on race, borders, and criminal law, we couldn't find a scholar within Europe that did scholarship based in race. And so we have this book that doesn't really have strong, like in Europe itself, Germany, France, Italy. That has changed a little, but not as much as I would like. And so the struggle still continues for us to have other people understand what is going on, even if on the TV it is so blatantly obvious, right? You would think we shouldn't have to have these conversations, but we still do. And so my scholarship is also based outside of the United States as a global project, and I know that TWAL, I guess, talks about that as well, but it truly is, right? This isn't about U.S. criminal law is just a domestic issue. Immigration is an international issue, right? Criminal law controls those within the United States, and immigration law controls those at our borders. It's has intersected at this time. It has converged. But to be able to have and separate based on what the rule of law and what we're conditioned to believe is also something that I write about and will continue to write about, and happy to discuss it later, but I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you all for being here. I think for the organizers, I'm grateful that they were able to create this space because I don't feel like there's always been a space for immigration at critical race theory conferences. And I'm grateful to all of you for being here to help claim that space to sort of bring this conversation to life. So, we talked earlier about sort of weaving our origin stories into this discussion a little bit. So I'm glad to know that we have students who are in the room. And I feel like in sort of narrating how critical race immigration theory has become a large part of what I do now, I think there's two journeys to track, right? One is the relationship between immigration and race, and then the other is between critical theory and more institutionalist studies of the law. And so for me, I went to law school because I wanted to follow in the steps of Thurgood Marshall, right? I had read about the civil rights movement and NAACP Legal Defense Fund when I was in college. I thought that was really inspiring. And so my first law school summer, I summered with LDF, right? And while I was there, I did learn a lot, but I also started to wonder how it related to my own life. And for the law students who are in the room, I know it's very hard to get sympathy for, the fears of your elders, right? Like back in the day, this is what happened. But back in the day, when I was a 1L, I was at NYU Law School in September of 2001. So that's 9/11. So the second week of law school, I was walking to civil procedure when we saw the planes hit. And that completely changed my experience of New York City, but also changed my orientation to the law. And it seemed to me that there really was a literal collision between the work on race and civil rights, which had been framed predominantly as a black-white issue, And the treatment that I was seeing of people around me in New York City who were mostly brown-skinned, people who, we say like flying while brown as opposed to driving while black, and where the idea of immigration and civil rights were very much conflated, right? And so I think that's one of my origin stories, is just that orientation from thinking about race as a separate subject, one that largely has been black and white. And I think that's probably true to some of the original impulses of the critical race studies movement, which makes sense given the history, the obsession, as you said, of the United States with a very particularized, very oppressive racial history. But it doesn't end there, right? And the experiences like my own and the ones that I was living through in New York, I think, were really evidence of that. And so then my orientation started to shift just a little bit. And part of the joy of this conference has been seeing colleagues, but also seeing mentors, like people that I would consider giants, people whose names I knew from books in the field of Asian American jurisprudence. So people like Jack or Bob Chang, who was elsewhere, Neil Gatanda, I saw earlier, Letty Volp's not in the room, but I know she mentored like Rose and others. And those were a lot of the people who, I read, like who I think of as sort of bringing me into the academy, bringing my interest into the academy, right? And so I think, through that time period, when I was in law school, a lot of what we did, NYU did not have an Asian Americans in the law class or an Asian American jurisprudence or an Asian American crit class. So what we did was, together with Jerry Lopez, who I think has passed through this building as well, but he was an NYU law professor when I was a student, we organized a group independent study. And what that meant was that Jerry signed off on the paperwork and then sat with us as a co-student as we taught ourselves Asian American jurisprudence, so reading all these people that I just mentioned. And that was my education in Asian American jurisprudence. It was like self-taught or peer-taught with Jerry Lopez by our side so that we could get some kind of credit for the time that we were putting in, right? So that was really the beginning of things. And, along the way, I'm going to try to speed this up because I'm now old enough that being a student is kind of a long time ago. But I ended up doing a PhD at Berkeley and writing my dissertation about language rights. And this is the time period where I met Rachel Moran, also in the room. But what I was really curious about then, it's this same collision, right, between race and immigration. Because what I was really interested in, again, inspiration of Thurgood Marshall, thinking about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the fact that 1 year later in 1965, the Immigration Act passes that leads to some of the most profound demographic changes we have, right? And specifically that it brings over so many more Asian immigrants to the United States, sort of opens up Latin America. So all of a sudden, you have a lot more racialized minorities who are also non-native English speakers and who have sort of different hues of skin, right? And so to me, the study of language rights was a way to understand how those two statutes came together, right? And how they morphed over time. So I will, again, skip a couple years, maybe I'll skip a decade or two. And I would just say that, I think that I guess that's the race and immigration piece. I would say the critical theory piece of it was really one of starting out with more of a critical perspective because of the experience of 9/11, learning from the people that I've just mentioned. But when I went to my first tenure track job, which was at the University of Colorado, I was told first to not put myself out there as a race scholar. Wow. I was also told that we didn't have a race in the law class there either. But to the extent it would come up in con law, there was a long queue for con law. And because I was junior faculty, I was probably not going to be able to teach that class anytime soon. And what they really needed was for someone to fill at least one of Hiroshi's shoes. Although I understand you didn't actually teach immigration when you were teaching at University of Colorado. Because you said you were doing like corporate. I thought you were doing IBT, no?
UNC.
Oh, okay. So then it was intentional. No one was teaching immigration law. So I was asked to teach immigration law as a more doctrinal class. I think in a lot of ways, because I was trying to fit into the faculty in the academy, I taught it from a much more institutionalist perspective. I didn't really think of the idea of that being a critical subject. That was more like something I had left behind with the study of race, right? And I think it wasn't really until after I got tenure that I felt that there was a little more freedom to define my own research agenda, which actually didn't mean that I first jumped into critical race theory. It first meant that I felt like I wanted to write a book, and I wanted to use the PhD skills, the interdisciplinary law and social science background. And so I wrote this book, Pursuing Citizenship, which was based on interviews with 100 different people who were seeking citizenship in some way. So it was trying to be a law and social science book, right, to be able to fit in seriously with social scientists as well as with law professors. And I will say I'm proud of the book that I wrote, but some of my smartest and also harshest critiques came from people that I considered close friends, and they were mostly my critical race theory friends. So she's not in the room right now, but she has since revealed to me, Laura Gomez was one of my peer reviewers on the manuscript. She also wasn't so harsh that I didn't get to publish the book. But she revealed herself to me because she wanted me to think hard. She wanted me to push hard on the extent to which race was part of the experience of pursuing citizenship, right? And to the extent that I was saying that citizenship, formal citizenship, was necessary but not sufficient, that maybe there was too much emphasis on the necessary, right? Which sort of implied that as long as you got citizenship, there would be more equality. And that would be, well, again, I didn't think it was sufficient, but that was really what we should focus on, right? And if we were going to draw out policy reforms, that's what we should really focus on. And so she was pushing me hard in another direction. Rose also, we had a lot of conversations about similar ideas. So the book I'm working on now, that I haven't worked on in a little while, but I'm trying to get back to, is about the limits of formal citizenship, and it more centrally puts race at the center of that. Why it is for some people that even after they acquire formal citizenship, they're still not equal, so really digging into that insufficiency.
I can't wait to read that. Thank you very much, Ming. Kathleen?
Thanks. I'll try to keep these. Sorry, I won't blare into the mic like I did before. Actually, Ming, I just have to mention before I forget, because I'm certain that you are friends and she's a colleague. But Evelyn Rangel Medina, who is who more recently entered academia, but who overlaps. I mean, in terms of the concept of citizenism as its own construct, and that centralizes racial hierarchy. And Yolanda, thank you for highlighting your experience in academia, because so much of what both actually Yolanda and Ming shared, I'm not going to repeat my own story with respect to those things, but really resonate with personal experience, and especially now. And I'll just say that I served as the first Associate Dean of Equity and Inclusion at Loyola Law School, and I was asked to serve 2 weeks after George Floyd's murder. So from 2020 to 2023, a 3-year term, which is standard at our school. There are a number of other immigration law professors who took on similar roles. And there are only a handful of times when we had the opportunity to connect and share our experiences, but felt strangely uniform. I mean, in terms of the agendas we're trying to aggressively advance, and we're actually parts, the main focus of our negotiating package, and even taking on those roles, and experiencing retaliation for it by the end of those terms, or maybe actually throughout, and then the end of those terms. So yeah, I think that institutions are suspect. I think that going into the Dean Suite when Black Lives Matter had reached international recognition. It's a global movement born in the U.S. that achieved mobilization on a scale that at least I had not seen in my lifetime. Encouraged me and my colleagues of color who really wanted me to take on the role to seize any and every opportunity that came along with the recognition of this very powerful racial justice movement. So I went in to seize the moment and really fought hard throughout. And you know, we get a year leave after serving in the Dean Suite, and I returned after that year to see a lot of those, what I thought would be sustained advancements, completely eliminated, dismissed, or rolled back. So, but my draw to law school and immigration came entirely from personal experience. I fit into the demographic of which we remark on in the article, the new American, mixed status immigrant families of color. I went to law school to be an immigrants' rights lawyer, and that's exactly what I did. I was an immigrants' rights lawyer on behalf of immigrant trafficked workers, who are all workers of color. When choosing a law school, I was teaching English in China. I didn't know how to distinguish law schools because every law school, or every fancy law school, because I didn't know how to, I was so sheltered. I didn't think I was sheltered until I went to law school. And then when I went to law school and I saw like bumper stickers for Bush Cheney, and then I encountered students in con law who had really opposing ideological views, which I didn't even know I had ideology until I went to law school. I thought I was operating on facts and truth. But I went to law school to serve a population that I grew up with, and I also worked with migrant farm workers growing up in the western Michigan, the agricultural fields outside of Detroit. So I was just like carrying forward. Has anyone seen Minari? That movie Minari? I mean, I identify so much with that movie. I know all of us do. Yeah. So I was just carrying forward that those lessons and that experience. And then when politics in the field in which I was in the trenches for compelled me to write a lot about it and gave me the opportunity to step into academia, I did. And understanding the systems interaction and also the power of government enforcement systems to keep exclusively people of color subordinated, and through the pretext of immigration enforcement got me really mad. So I thought, well, I think I can better fulfill at least like this expertise that I'm growing by writing about it and engaging with students and colleagues in the space. So that's when I met. And I didn't see Jack in the room. So, but that's when I met Jack and Hiroshi and Rose, and just the people who really, Bob Chang, and as Ming said, the other critical race scholars, and Neil Gotunda. That's when I met all these people who really shaped my. Helped me develop a voice, a scholarly voice that drew from what I knew about, lived experience, but also my experience as a civil rights lawyer, and then translate that into scholarship that could make a contribution and that courts could cite too, So here I am now. Well, actually 20 years later. So I guess I started 2005, but I didn't know that was going to be an entry into where I am now. And I don't know if I'm in a good place or not, but I know that I know proud's not the right word to use, but I am really proud of the the movement of immigration legal scholars who have this really wide-ranging set of skills and lived experiences behind them to back up what their message is and what their contributions are to this field now.
Thanks, Kathleen. So, yeah, I guess I will share my origin story a bit too. Instead of Thurgood Marshall, I was inspired by Angela Davis, former Black Panther, to go to law school. And I say that in all seriousness because as an undergraduate, I was fortunate enough to study, came from a very sheltered background, I will say, but fortunate enough to study with Cedric Robinson, who wrote a book called Black Marxism, and which work has become very popular in the last 10 years or so. And I took modern political thought with him and then film studies classes. And so I was always interested in and concerned about power, race, and representation. And after law school, after my time at UC Santa Barbara, I thought about either law school or film and media studies, because I think that the use of narrative in shaping society and politics and race and our understandings of who we are in relations to each other were very important. And I actually spent a year here in Los Angeles, and I worked part-time, I worked actually full-time in the film industry, doing super low-level work, grunt work, basically, and was very quickly disillusioned with respect to how I would be able to make some sort of a difference through mainstream, through the mainstream film industry. And at the same time, I was doing work with an organization called Families to Amend California's 3 Strikes. Has anyone heard of it? Mm-hmm. So they were trying to amend the third strike of the 3 Strikes law so that people wouldn't be sent to prison for 25 years to life when they had a third offense that was, I won't go into details, but it was is still a very harsh and punitive criminal law, and of course has racially disparate impacts. And so I got involved with them. And has anyone heard of Refuse and Resist? That was an organization that was doing on-the-ground work to free political prisoner Mumia Abu-Jamal. Mm-hmm. So I was sort of becoming aware of the shape and nature of racial injustice and power and privilege in lots of different arenas and places. And that was also the time in which the critical resistance movement was born. And so prison abolition was sort of a nascent movement, I think, in sort of this era. And all of that inspired me to go to law school, and I was very proud to attend UC Davis School of Law and spent time working with, and Jack Chin. And I took Kevin Johnson's first Latinos in the Law class. I was incredibly lucky to have that opportunity and worked as his research assistant, and he has been a mentor and supporter of me all of these years, and it's been a very long time. And so I did work in the prison clinic, and then I was in law school when September 11 happened, and there was a professor there, Jim Smith, who was involved in the clinic and taught immigration law, and thought deeply, though didn't write as much as others, I think in some ways. He was very much involved with representing people, but was concerned about this confluence of race and immigration and imprisonment. And that was also where sort of my interests were converging, and my concerns about what it meant to put people behind bars and label people a terroristic threat or a danger, and how that was contributing to the manufacturing of race and causing this subordination on multiple levels. And so after law school, I practiced immigration law and spent a good deal of time doing that. I worked on cases involving the terrorism bars, which are incredibly expansive, and even immigration lawyers to this day don't always believe or understand how expansive they are. And I didn't actually start doing any writing until I had been practicing for quite a while. And I think what caused me to become interested in scholarship and writing was I was writing a lot of appellate briefs, and I was finding myself, for students in the room, you might be starting to already get a sense of this, but there's only so much you can do through the law and the legal system. So I was incredibly frustrated with the limitations of what I could argue in a brief. There were so many things that I just could not say because there are policy arguments, or you can't argue about racial bias when you're talking about a deportation statute, for example. So I started reading a lot and started producing my own scholarship. And my first work was sort of crimmigration, I think, before it was called crimmigration, this convergence of criminal and immigration law. And everyone here, I think, has also been a part of that school of thought that Juliet Stemfet, Lewis, and Clark kind of created, as far as giving it a name. What?
Sorry, I totally did what I was not supposed to do.
Oh,
Go on.
No, you can just turn on your mic.
Oh, I just wanted to mention that. Well, Yolanda and Jackson, who worked on the. Yolanda, who worked on the Padilla case, and then Jack's work at the intersection of crimes and immigration, heavily cited in Padilla. I just wanted to mention that. That's all.
No,
that's
thank
all.
you.
That's
and
all.
Has long been, and has
all.
long been an influence for me.
That's
thank
all.
you for adding that. Yeah. So it was the time of the criminal alien program and secure communities and 287G agreements, and some of us were doing scholarship around that and talking about the ways in which the racial bias that had been studied fairly well at that point in the criminal legal system migrated into the immigration system through that interaction. And then we had President Obama, who, is controversial from the standpoint of immigration law, and launched the Priority Enforcement Program, which was meant to supposedly target felons, not families, and then that reinforced the same kind of implicit racializing rhetoric. And so my work is focused on essentially the role of race and migration and criminalization of immigrants and of migration, and what it means to imprison people to deter migration, and then the plenary power doctrine, which is this doctrine. Have students learned about the plenary power doctrine? Has anyone heard of it? Okay, so probably just a couple. It's this idea that the Supreme Court, it comes from multiple disciplines, but in immigration law, the 19th century and the Chinese Exclusion Act era cases, where the court basically said, called Chinese migration an invasion, rhetoric that, of course, President Trump has employed in his first administration and more recently. And then when the political branches create immigration law or policy, because immigration law concerns national security and sovereignty, the Supreme Court will give more deference when it comes to consideration of those policies. And that same deference, whether stated or not, scholars have written a lot about this, but has ebbed and flowed. But the long and short of it is there really is effectively no equal protection doctrine and no anti-discrimination or anti-racist kind of doctrine that exists in immigration law. And so that's what I've studied and looked at. Some of you probably remember the first Trump administration and the attempt to rescind DACA, and all of the incredibly racist, anti-Latino, anti-Latinx rhetoric. Yet the Supreme Court said, nothing to see here. We can only look at the actual language of the law. If it's not clear that the intent of the lawmaker was to discriminate, then we can't consider this to be a valid disparate impact kind of case. And so I dug into exploring what is the intent doctrine in constitutional law, And then how is it reinforced and exacerbated through this plenary power doctrine where the court will defer anyhow to the political branches? And I think my concern now is that the plenary power doctrine has essentially set the stage for this just utter lawlessness and these anti-democratic trends when it comes to immigration law and beyond. And I think people in the mainstream are starting to realize that immigration law and race have been they've set the stage for what we're currently seeing. And I actually, if I may, I wouldn't mind, since we've all been talking at you for a long time, if anyone has any thoughts or questions about that. Yes.
My name is Manuel Arias. I'm a director with the organization called Homies Unidos, and our work.
Homies Unidos?
Homies Unidos.
Oh yeah, I
Right
have.
on.
Sorry, great.
Yeah.
So immigration is where I work at intersection of immigration and the intersection impact it has on our constituents who are being impacted or system impacted. Our background is in gang peace treaties and reducing gang violence back since the 1990s and driving a lot of shifts in California politics as far as justice reform. And your frustration, right? It's not lost on us. Like the legal scholars, we have immigration law, that's immigration law. We have, the criminalization of communities or poverty, right? So it's the same thing in the community, right? Applicants or justice reform applicants, they don't have nothing to do with immigration. And then, so we're constantly pulling these roads together. And we've been having some success until now we're seeing the militarization, the confluence of the militarization of both immigration and now they're using immigration law to pull in through the immigration criminal law and recently named the people who we work for, South Lucia, 18th Street, and all the gangs in Westlake as international terrorist organization, which takes us into a totally different legal dynamic, and we're trying to figure out who's out there to show us how to make that stop. So one of the things we were thinking about doing is class action lawsuit on First Amendment rights. By being an association, we have every right to be angry if we want to. And that seems to be the concept of being a terrorist blocks us from traveling, from government aid, from getting a job, and it's not like it hasn't been done before. So we're looking for scholars to connect with us. And so my question is, who's out there when we're looking at this concept of militarizing this intersection of criminalization, and what's the intersectional impact that we should be looking for, the impacts down the road?
May I comment?
Yeah.
Actually, the panelist who isn't here. Right?
Angelica.
Yeah.
Yeah, Angelica. So, we have a fifth panelist who couldn't be here today, but who's done a lot challenging the, I was talking about legitimacy before, but challenging the legitimacy of immigration law and policy and its practices in general, the whole immigration regime, and consistent with, I'm explicit with my, ideology, even though I believe it. I thought it was based on truth and facts. But my ideology, my anti-carceral ideology, and also as you described, how these systems interact to exclude, marginalize, subordinate, oppress, harm outsider groups. And you're working at the confluence of several identities that work to the advantage of this particular administration with a really calculated strategy under it's Project 2025. And so I wanted to mention civil rights lawyers so my colleagues, Sean Kennedy at the Center for Juvenile Law and Policy at our law school, Loyola Law School. He he's done a lot of work on deputy gangs. And so interestingly, it's been, you know, he's really impactful. But this is where the limits of the law come in, because he's very creative. He's the federal public defender of Central California for many years before the law school recruited him to be the executive director of our Center for Juvenile Law and Policy, but in order to craft a persuasive complaint, because his longtime research has exposed deputy gangs in police departments and sheriff's divisions, right? And in order to highlight this and file a complaint, actually under the Racial Justice Act, which is an under-recognized but recent legislation in California that prescribes that California prohibits racism in its enforcement agencies, and also includes preventative measures, prohibition measures into the formation of gangs in law enforcement departments. But the constraints of the law also make it so his work in challenging the existence of deputy gangs is to characterize them as terrorist organizations and to utilize and leverage the definition of gang and gang membership that law enforcement has propagated to identify in his research, identify those groups that exist and are sustained by law enforcement systems. You know, and so you see the tension there, because the sweeping definition of gangs and how it affects communities is inaccurate, even with respect to how gangs are defined by law enforcement departments. You know, the Cal Gang database includes everyone and their unborn cousins in the Cal Gang database.
We get that part. In fact, a lot of their definition kind of strengthens our claim that it's the First Amendment.
Yes.
Like, because it's about fighting against discriminatory treatment and maximum amplifying our voice. The question is how, in this environment, and who's doing studies like work on how we put a backstop on the bridging between. Because once we get forward into a military court situation, right, then all our tactics in the community are gone.
So I have a comment about that, and it's not helpful actually, and it's definitely not the answer that you're seeking. But you know, earlier I talked about this praxis dimension of at least among advocates and scholars, in the immigration space and the critical race theory space that we seek. So my current article is about climate servitude, and then the praxis part is. I discuss what I call critical mobilization, which is what homogeneous does, these intersectoral alliances, and what critical resistance set the example for, and others like it. So movements, Black Lives Matter, movements that seek mass mobilization across sectors that de-silo, that deliberately de-silo to that are deliberately inclusive and also interdisciplinary. So there's rigor also. And then it's the movement leaders are the affected population with lived experiences. And that is valid evidence. And that is in opposition to conservative movements that are top-down and also rhetoric-based. The spokesperson for conservative movements is never anyone that could claim being an affected individual.
Let's continue that conversation after the panel. No, it's great. Thank you. I'd actually like to. I'm going to skip to one of the other questions that we had. So the next question I have for our panelists, which I'm actually going to take the liberty to spend 1 minute on answering myself first, out of order, is how do national and international political trends influence CILT scholarship, and what are the challenges of doing this work? And so again, the question is, how do national and international political trends influence this work? And, you know, I think for many of us, it seems like it would be obvious that it would and should and is. There's the academic freedom component, where some, I think, are really nervous about what they can say and try to put out there. And I know I've done some work as a public scholar writing op-eds, and I've invited people recently who I've co-authored with to write an op-ed with me, and they've said, I don't feel safe doing that. I'm not willing to put myself out there in that way anymore. And then we all have varying challenges potentially at our institutions, where the institution needs to exist and make money and you know, make sure that donors are happy and that students are happy, and students who don't all necessarily want to talk about DEI or critical race studies in their classrooms. So there's that challenge. At the same time, part of me personally feels like, how is it that we're not all talking about the role of race and the relationship between race and power and the lawlessness that we currently see, and how it intersects with all of the other areas and disciplines? Like, I think this was mentioned in one of the other sessions, that every single first-year doctrinal class could potentially have a component that addresses power and race, but at the same time, you know, we all have our areas of expertise that we write in, so I don't expect every legal scholar to start writing about race, but I think the sense of urgency causes me to question how we move forward. But so I think next we have, why don't we go to Ming, Kathleen, and Yolanda?
Sure. So I was thinking that, you know, maybe one way of opening up the conversation a little bit is to think about what it means to be in this zone of immigration exceptionalism, right? This idea that there is this rights-free zone, to borrow a phrase from Munir Ahmed in his writing about Guantanamo, right? So really thinking hard about the military and why that tribunal is so different, right? Is that I always think about Guantanamo at this moment when I teach immigration law, because, you know, I think it's not a coincidence that so many of the key gateways to immigration that have been exclusionary are islands. So I always imagine them as literally these spaces that are not seen as part of the continental United States, right? And because they're disconnected, the same system of laws, the same expectation of equality or due process or any sort of legitimate institution is not held there, right? And so in my head, that's how I've always thought about it. The way that I see it, my work is not mostly at the intersection of crime and immigration, but where I see it is in thinking about the research I'm doing now is on international students. And I think what's similar to what you're seeing in the public eye with international students, and what has been exposed a lot longer for crimmigration, is just the clear injustice and punitiveness that's out of proportion, right, to the crimes or the offenses that have either actually been committed or even haven't been committed at all, right? Like you have extreme cases like Mahmoud Khalil, right, who was being told that his international student visa was going to be revoked. And when he said he didn't have an international student visa because he was a green card holder, you know, he was told that that would be revoked too, right? And it's just this, you know, this Kafka-esque sort of tangle, right, of what's trapped him in the law. And I think, you know, one thing I've thought about and talked with friends about is, you know, as the whole saga unfolds in the news, you know, I'm like, maybe the silver lining is that people will finally see how bad it is, and they'll say it's gone too far, right? And I keep watching it get worse and wondering, when do we reach that point? And then it occurred to me, the way I put it when I talked to my husband, who's also a civil rights lawyer, is, when are we going to hit Selma? Like, when are we going to hit the moment in the civil rights movement where people looked up and saw police beating people, right, beating students for exercising their First Amendment rights, and said, oh, I don't want to be part of that, right? That's too much. And then it actually started to change public opinion, right? And then you started to see the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965, right? People sort of recognizing that things had gone too far. And so I keep asking myself, when are we going to see Selma? And I will say that my big fear is that you're never going to see Selma in the sphere of immigrants' rights, because immigrants are seen as being outside of the country, right? Again, they're on that island, they're exceptional. The usual rules of constitutional law, equal protection and due process and First Amendment simply aren't expected to apply, right? So that's my big fear. How it connects up to critical race theory, in some ways, I think the analysis is very similar. We're just looking at a different set of laws that exert such extreme control. I think there's a way in which it's totalizing at a degree that hasn't been part of sort of the civil rights history in a few decades. But I think there are similarities there. I just think that is one critical difference, is that until you have, again, it's not a coincidence, right? The end of slavery is going from Dred Scott to the 14th Amendment, right? That's citizenship. And we're talking about citizenship and immigration. It's not a coincidence, I think, that both of the words are citizenship, right? And the idea is sort of pre and post citizenship, what new expectations are there for a more formalized equality, right? And then my worry is, because an immigrant is by definition not a citizen, that there won't be that expectation.
Sobering, but reasonable. Yeah. Kathleen?
Actually, thanks, Ming. I'm going to pick up on that. So yeah, it's not a mere coincidence that the Reconstruction era, which Carrie remarked on before, when the earliest, foundational Supreme Court opinions on immigration created the plenary power. So this is the end of the Reconstruction era that welcomed federal government and also adjudicated state legislation that attempted to regulate immigration through immigration restrictions. Also saw an influx of new crimes, and crimes for just hanging out. These are crimes that could only be enacted by the lived experience and observing what happens after 150 years of chattel slavery is eliminated. And in between the ratification of the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, at least a short amount of time, when newly freed slaves were not permitted to get jobs. They did not have access to freedom of contract. They didn't have access to right to property. They didn't have access to civil courts. And there were a lot of white supremacist employers who refused to hire black employees under conditions that were not slavery. So there were things like vagrancy, loitering, all of those kinds of things became criminalized. And by criminalizing that kind of ordinary life conduct, newly freed slaves became re-enslaved and then subjected to carceral labor systems. And at the same time, immigration restrictions started to appear, and immigration detention started to appear. And both the prohibition of chattel slavery and the re-enslavement of newly freed slaves occurred in parallel to the U.S. government devising ways to fill labor gaps through workers who are migrants of color, but then conceiving of systems to deport them when they were unusable. And my first ancestor to come to the United States was one of those workers who came in 1903 and worked on sugar plantations in Hawaii, and then got deported for smoking opium because it became a crime to smoke opium instead of eat it. Because that's what white people did at the time. It was popular back then. And actually, I'm not going to go into other challenges. I'll just stop there.
We talk about this with critical race theory, lat crit, et cetera, and obviously in the critical race studies, but that the law works as it's supposed to, right? And I think sometimes we have this fairy tale as if the law isn't working, right? It was structured, but somehow it's not working the way it was supposed to. But I think many times we have to frame it as power understood the way they constructed the law, and it works exactly as they want it to work. And so one of the things that I think I struggle with, at least this moment in time, is at least sometimes there was a recognition of going too far. But I think historically, particularly when we're seeing people of color that are defined as non-citizens and dehumanized in a way that we know through, social psychology theories such as stereotype content theory is just one that comes to my head, is if, we as a society believe that someone forms a particular quadrant, and in stereotype content theory they talk about whether or not we think that they're competent and they're warm, right? And if they're competent and warm, they have the highest regard in society. But if they're seen as uncompetent and cold, they can be seen in a dehumanizing way to the point that that they are allowed to be dehumanized to the point of being killed. And society will support that. And I really do believe that Susan Fisk is someone who does a lot of this and has done work particularly with migrants and Latinos, and they're at the bottom of the hierarchy along with homeless, and we know how the globe treats homeless, and those who are addicted to drugs, right? And so they're at the bottom of the rung. And so what we have to do when we talk about remedies is humanize them, right? And so I think to be hopeful, right, we have to end up getting out there, and media and everything else has to reframe the rhetoric from a dehumanizing way to a humanizing way, right? And, I think somebody just before, I think it was you, Carrie, that talked about, Obama's, families not felons, right? Mothers not, gangbangers, et cetera, and completely missed the boat on that, right? And so we see this issue, and it was interesting because he said that, and then he was at the NAACP conference, and he talks about race is intertwined in the criminal justice system and what we have to do, right? But yet immigration, right? The laws that were coming past allowed race, to still be this factor within immigration enforcement. And so I think also the divide sometimes between this idea of being foreign or Latino takes away sometimes, obviously they're not the only ones affected, from this idea of we have people like on the immigration side who are we're not criminals, right? Which then sort of takes them out, right? Somehow they're other. They are trying to get back into the box of being respectable and allowed to come in. And then we have the criminal justice people, as you said, who don't want to deal with immigration because they don't see as an issue within their system. One could argue that there's still racial divides there as well, right? And so that's another remedy, is we need to come together to have an understanding of this is about subordination of groups of color, and therefore we should all be talking about this. And you see it wonderfully in the beginning, in the, critical race studies, right? Laura Gomez, Devin Carbato, right? Cheryl Harris, Jerry King, right? All across the board, right? Diverse, right? And we see, right, Laura Gomez talking about manifest destiny and with Latinos. We see Cheryl Harris and Devin Carbato talking about this undocumented criminal procedure, right? Bringing the way in which laws in immigration have influenced Supreme Court decisions that affect, right, U.S. citizens as well, because that's really what we're all about. It doesn't just affect, doesn't affect immigrants. It affects us as U.S. citizens, particularly if we're seen as foreign. And this goes to this idea of citizenship, how even if we obtain citizenship, we're always going to be
alien citizens.
Alien citizens, as Maynai says, right?
Yeah.
And we see that with sort of Vasquez Perdomo as well. And so I guess, and unfortunately, right, it's not going to get any easier for many of us because the anti-academic movement. And so I come from Ohio, where Senate Bill 1 passed this year. And so I'm actually teaching a controversial belief, right? And so I'm waiting to see if, I get sued, right? And I have a university who has basically said, well, if you get sued, you're on your own. And so
that's the norm, I think.
But at least, there's some some states maybe that aren't subjected to that. So, and, do I support, intellectual diversity in the classroom? And we have now post-tenure review, so we can still be fired even if we have tenure. And so I just got an email literally about 5 minutes ago, well, not 5 minutes before this started, talking about the dean just announced that the university will no longer support any non-university entity, organization, or person for any event, activity, program, or wherein the mission or purpose of the event, activity, program, or organization is based on race, color, national origin, ancestry, religion, sexual orientation. So I guess I shouldn't even be here, right? So that's the problem that we're going to face for many of us. And so the question is, we really need to stick together in order to support each other in this time to be able to continue this fight. And I guess find really good lawyers who will help us pro bono.
The students.
So I think we just have another couple minutes. If anyone in the audience, I know it's been a really long day. Thanks for hanging out with us and having this conversation. Yeah, please.
Thanks for this. This is so great. So I agree about the limitations of citizenship. Obviously, I'm a Latina living through this moment in Los Angeles, so I'm very much understanding the limitations of citizenship. So I wanted to hear from you all, what is an alternative framework then? Like, where do we go from this understanding of the limitations of citizenship? What should we strive for?
I mean, to me, I'm teaching a class on citizenship right now, and we just started the unit on alternative sites of citizenship. So I don't know that it's getting rid of the idea of citizenship altogether, if what we mean by citizenship goes beyond immigration law definitions of citizenship, right? So I think in terms of the alternative sites, I think in a place like California, you can certainly go down subnational citizenship, whether it's belonging as Californian, as someone who's in Los Angeles, as someone who's part of the UCLA campus, right? I think that's some of the language of creating sanctuary communities. I think that, some of you, I don't know if I guess more of you were, if you were all here, then you weren't in the Bay Area. But I didn't sleep a lot the first night because in the Bay Area, you know, there was all this news, it's more than rumors, that there was going to be the next big federal surge was going to be in San Francisco, right? And in thinking about the sanctuary movement and resistance, I was really proud that my church, I live in Berkeley now, has a minister of social justice. And my minister of social justice was in Oakland at the entry to where the Coast Guard was stationed. And so there were pictures in the newspaper of him in his clerical collar and his gown.
Cool.
Yeah, holding up the guy who got his foot run over, right?
Wow.
So, I mean, I think, so it means going down. I think it means going out, right? So when we think about churches, it's non-state sites of citizenship and belonging. And I've been learning a lot at this conference and with this class that I'm co-teaching this semester on comparative equality and anti-discrimination law, which is about going up, right? So supra-citizenship, looking at international human rights regimes, regional rights in places like the EU. And then the other place I would go is, you know, it's a weird thing to say in a law school, but to not let the law limit your imagination about what citizenship means, right? Like there's a lot of, like Linda Bosniak, who I think a lot of us read early on, talks about citizenship not only as formal citizenship, but economic citizenship, social citizenship, cultural citizenship, political citizenship, right? San Francisco doesn't talk about it very much right now because of all the claims of immigration fraud, but there's been a long tradition of non-citizens being able to vote in the San Francisco Unified School District members. So you can have political citizenship, again, at different scales. So that would be my answer, is different scales, up, down, and broader.
I would just say really quickly, thinking more broadly and systemically, questioning the bordering regimes so that citizenship isn't the end-all, be-all. And I think it's Amy Branzell who writes about that too.
That's great. Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, actually, so with every bleak reality or dystopian, the dystopia that we're living in, I mean, there is opportunity for imagination, and but maybe that imagination is actually can manifest, and survival salons, but survival salons not to just vent, but actually as a mechanism for movement building, because my limitations, I feel, are in myself. My own limits. I need to hang out with homies and ethos. You know, like I need to. We have to build our own movements, and it has to be subversive now. So you know, Hiroshi's been an incredible mentor to me, but also his references to the arts, like his references to what is outside of the legal sector, de-siloing. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Lives of Others, and so is he. And I don't know if you knew that, how much of a fan I was of Lives of Others, but that's always stuck with me, because there is a space that's captured under East Cold War, East Berlin, that even though it's being surveilled, it's possible for people to maintain their bonds and keep their bonds with each other, humanitarian bonds. And I think that the courage in us comes from, like, we have to actualize this though. And when we start to brainstorm with others, then organically we come up with new ideas. Then we're not limited. I'm not limited by my cynicism. I really believe in that, and that's why I think, this is what I call critical mobilization, and that's, I guess it's like law review jargon, but I believe in it. And it's the de-siloing cross-sectoral alliances, and I think it needs to come from camaraderie that's not, without expectation, but an alignment of values. And I think so long as we sustain ourselves, then resistance will, I can't even say prevail, I was about to say prevail, but resistance will make progress. It will show itself.
And I think given the extremes that we're seeing, we should be inspired to think as broadly and creatively and radically as ever before. If there was ever a time to do so, it seems like it has to be now. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Stella. I'm a third-year graduating law student at UCLA Law, and I'm also a leader in immigrants' rights movement in California. Do you have any advice to immigrants who are preparing to assert their own rights and define what it means to be undocumented or non-citizen themselves?
Take my number. No, I mean, I'm just like, not that. So as you know, our law students, I mean, among them, there might be a few documented, but those who have not had access to that are undocumented. But they made it there, and I'm sure you can identify with this through a struggle. I mean, through embracing their confidence and their courage, and that's what propelled them forward. I don't think anyone should deny who they are, right? But I think that as law students, future lawyers, I do advise being strategic about it and ensuring allies and resources and working with others because you're the best messenger for immigrants' rights. We're here to serve you, right?
Thank you, everyone. I know we've kept you a minute or two past, so thanks a lot. We'll be here if you have any questions afterwards. And thank you for organizing.